Today's daf is daf Chaf Dalid, and we'll start on Chaf Gimel Amid Beis, approximately 11 lines up, 10 lines up from the bottom Yosef. So the Mishnah says that if the Kohen does the avoda in a sitting position, then the avoda is mechulelis, it's psula, it's disqualified. Minalan, how do we know this? Omar Rava, Omar of Nachman, Omar Kra, La'amod l'shares. The Torah says that when the Kohen is mishares and he does the avoda, then he has to be standing. And La'amido b'charti v'lo liyeshiva. I have designated the Kohanim to do my avoda when they are standing and not when they are sitting. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, La'amod l'shares mitzvah. If I only had one pasuk, then the rule in Kodshim is one pasuk is only lechatchila. But kshu omer ha'omdim, but there's a repetition and whenever the Torah repeats itself in Kodshim, it's likuva, is shana lavakos of liakif. So the repetition teaches me that it's absolutely indispensable, and therefore, in a state of sitting, his avoda is disqualified. Amalei Rav of Nachman Michti Yoshev Kezar Domi. Shouldn't we equate a Kohen who's sitting to a non-Kohen? Umechel avoda, and therefore he disqualifies his avoda, and the korban is pasul. Amo, shouldn't we therefore logically, taking this analogy to its logical conclusion, ma zar b'misa af Yoshev b'misa. If a non-Kohen does the avoda, he's chayv misa b'dei shamayim, and therefore a Kohen in a sitting position, likewise, since his status is like equal to that of a non-Kohen, he should be chayv misa b'dei shamayim. And alama tanya. So then, why do we have a brisa that seems to say the opposite? Aval orel onein yoshev einan b'misa el bazara. That in the following three cases of a Kohen who is disqualified. Number one, an Orel, he did not undergo circumcision. An Onain, he lost one of his close 7 relatives before the Kvura. And Yoshev, someone who is in a sitting position. They are all in one category, namely that there's a violation of a lav if they go ahead and do the avoda, but they're not chayiv misa. And the Gemara says, Mishum davi mechusar begodim v'shalo rochutz yadayim v'raglayim. Shnei ksum abom kecha v'ein malamd. So he says the following, that although in theory we should have had an equation between a Kohen b'yeshiva and a non-Kohen azar, and that would generate a chiv misa v'dei shamayim, but we have a principle called Shnei ksum abom kecha v'ein malamdin. When the Torah teaches us the same halacha twice, it implies that this halacha only applies in those two cases, but not in any other case. And therefore, we have two cases in which the Torah repeats that the Kohen is chayev misa b'dei shamayim. And those are the case of mechusar begodim, where the Kohen is wearing less than the 4 begodim that he's required to wear when he does the avodah. And we have the case of Eino Rochutz Yadayim Raglayim, where he did not do Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim to wash and prepare his hands and his feet. So that's going to prove to me that in other cases, for example, a Kohen who's Yoshev, he's not Chayev Misa B'dei Shamayim. And now we start today's daf Chav Dalid, and the Gemara says, V'chol Shnei Ksuva Bom Kein Chayev Melamd V'an Diyom Melamd. But we have another shita that says that if the Torah repeats the same halacha, on the contrary, it's coming to teach you that we should universalize that halacha. So what are we going to do in that case? And the Gemara now is going to postulate that although there's a Mandiyom who says that if the Torah repeats itself and you have it twice, then you could universalize, but not if it has it thrice. And therefore, Shasu Yayin Havile Shlishi, there's a third case of a category of a Kohen who, if he does the avodah in an intoxicated state, then not only is avodah psula, but he's chayiv misa b'dei shamayim, and therefore we have a principle called shlosha l'divrei kolei malamda, that 3 psukim certainly will limit that halacha, in this case the chayiv misa b'dei shamayim, to those 3 cases. Omer al gabi kelim, al gabi behem, al gabi ragli chaver apostle. The Mishnah establishes that the feet of the Kohen have to be directly in contact with the ritzpas ha'azara, the floor of the azara. And therefore, if he steps onto an animal or any utensil, or he's actually stepping on his colleague's legs, his feet, then the avoda is psula. So Gemara says, Minolan, how do we know this? Now, what we're going to soon see is that we're going to have an analogy between the avoda of the Kohen and the relationship between the body of the Kohen and the begodim, the big day kahuna. And just like the goof, the body of the Kohen has to be in direct contact without any separation from the begodim, so too the body of the Kohen has to be in direct contact with the floor of the azara. The Tana de Bei Rabbi Shmuel Hoil v'ritzpa mekudeshes u'klisharis mekudashim. Now the phrase klisharis here, which usually means any utensil that's being used and was sanctified with Shemen HaMishcha, etc., here in this context, klisharis is referring to the big day kahuna, and the Torah equates klisharis with ritzpa. Why is there an equation? Because just like the klisharis, again, the big day kahuna, have been sanctified, and they sanctify the Kohen who's wearing them, and that prepares him for doing the avodah, so too the ritzpah of the azara is sanctified, and that adds sanctity to the body of the Kohen who's standing on the ritzpah, allowing him to do the avodah. And therefore, ma kli sharis, and in this context of this analogy to the big day kahuna, is lo avi dover chotzis beino bein kli sharis, lo yehei, there cannot be any separation, anything that comes in between, it wedges between his body and the big day kahuna that he's wearing. In fact, we had a Gemara that vacillated back and forth about avir, even if there's air that goes into his begodim. You may remember that. And the Gemara concludes that that's maybe the darko, but in any event, you can't have a chatzitza between the goof of the Kohen ha'oved and the big day kahuna, is so too af ritzpa lo yehi dover chotzeis beino leveno ritzpa. You cannot have anything that separates him from his feet in this case, from the ritzpa, from the floor of the azor. The floor of the azor is makadishim and is machshir him to do the avodah. Now, we have three different cases. The Gemara now is going to have to analyze why was it necessary for the Mishnah to repeat this three times. Just tell me that the Kohen has to be standing directly on the ritzpah with no separation. So the Gemara continues and says the following: Tzricha, we need all three cases. The iash meaning keli, if we only had the case where he's standing on some sort of a clear utensil, maybe he has a stepping stool or something, is mishum delav mina de basar ninu. That's not flesh, that's not live flesh. So therefore we would assume that something that's not part of an animal or a human being, an animate object, then it's min b'sheinu mino and it's chotzetz. Aval behema de mina de basar hu, but an animal which is flesh, and therefore the flesh of the Kohen is not separated from the ritzpah except by another piece of flesh, in this case the animal, and that's not a chatzitza because it's min b'mino. And therefore I would assume that if the Kohen is standing on the back of an animal, that would not in any way disqualify. And if the Mishnah had only told me that if the Kohen is standing on the animal's back, that disqualifies him because the animal is a chatzitza separating his feet from the ritzpah, the lo mina di adamu, because it's not in any way connected to a human being. Aval chavero di adamu. So the Mishnah is going from one chiddush to another chiddush to another chiddush, and that's called lozu afzu. Not only if he's standing on a kli, which is made of metal or whatever it's made of, and that's called min b'sheino mina because it's not flesh, that's live. Even in the case where he's standing on something that's flesh, that's alive, an animal, and that's basar, and therefore you might think it's min b'minu, even that's considered a separation between his feet and the ritzpah sadzot to pasal is avodah. And now the Mishnah is going to tell me afzu, even in a case where he's standing on a human being and his feet are on top of the feet of a Kohen, I might think that in that case it's mamish min b'mino, it's not chotzetz, tzricha. Therefore, the Mishnah has to tell me that even in that third case, where the Kohen is standing on the feet of another Kohen, even so, it invalidates his avodah. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, raglo achas al hakli raglo achas haritzpah. what's going to be the deal if he has one foot that's directly in contact with the floor, the other foot is on top of a utensil? Well, you might ask the following question: could he stand on one foot that's on the ritzpah? Another case. Raglo achas ala even, raglo achas ala ritzpah. One foot is on top of a stone that separates him from this, but the other foot is directly on the ritzpah. What should we do, Rowan? We have to analyze. We have to check it out. Let's do a scientific experiment. Kol she'ilu yinotel akli v'tinotel ha'even yochol lamed al raglo achas v'yavad avodas l'ksher. If when we remove that utensil from under his foot, and therefore he's standing on one foot, or we remove the stone that's under his foot, and now he's standing on one foot, can he do the avodah standing on one foot? Is he so agile? And if so, then his avodah is ksheira, because it's considered like he has 2 feet on the ground without any separation. But in lav, if let's say when we pull out the stone from under his foot, his one foot, or we pull out the kli from on his foot, and then he falls apart, he wiggles around, but he can't do the avodah, then avodah psul, because then we assume that he is not really standing on the ritzpah. Boy, Rabbi Ami vacillated about the following question: Nidal deloha even v'yomed aleha mahu. What happens if this stone that's part of the ritzpah was a stone floor, and one of the particular avonim got loose? It's like a tooth, that's loose. And the Kohen was standing on that loose stone when he did the avodah. So Gemara says the following: what is his intention with regard to that stone? Once it got loose, does he want to remove it and replace it? Or is he going to plaster it down? Everything depends upon his kavanah, his intention. If he has no intention of putting this stone back, on the contrary, get rid of it, then for sure the stone is a foreign object, it's not part of the ritzpah, and therefore it's chotz, it's kiti boilcha. When did Rabbi Ami have this suffix? It's only the daite lechabra. His intention was to plaster it down and put it back, replace it in its place. What is the halacha? Do we say they came into daite lechabra kamod lechabri dami? Do we consider as if it's already attached and replaced and relocated in its place because that was his intention? Or do we say no? Dilma hashta mialo talisha. Right now it's still disconnected from the ground. It's loose. And you just have to pick it up, even though he has an intention to plaster it down, but right now he hasn't done it. And the Gemara doesn't come to any conclusion at this point. Rabbi Zuti boile hachi. The same question came up in a discussion between Rabba and Boy Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Ami. So before we had Boy Rabbi Ami, now we have a slightly different version of what Rabbi Ami was vacillating it down. Nekra even v'yomed b'mkom mahu. What happens if the stone was actually removed from the ritzpas hazara? The Kohen stood directly on the dirt that's under this piece of granite of this tile. My kami boile. So now the Gemara analyzes what was bothering the mind of Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami had 2 understandings about David HaMelech and what David HaMelech accomplished and what he intended to achieve when he was Makadesh the Mokom HaMikdash. Now, we have to understand something very fundamental. The Mikdash was actually built by the son of David HaMelech, that's Shlomo HaMelech. But David HaMelech was Makadesh the location and sanctified it. After he bought the Garon Arnona, he purchased it, designated it, and he was Makadesh it. So the Gemara now vacillates. Ki Kadesh David Ritzpah, when David went ahead and he was Makadesh, is Ritzpah Yonah Kadesh? Did he only sanctify the top layer, which are the stones, the granite that covers the Ritzpah? Or shall we say, Adi Aris to the Homa Kadesh? He sanctified the ground all the way down to the core of the earth, so that when the Kohen is standing on the ground, the dirt, the earth, I should say, and not on the stone, if you're going to say that David was only Mekadesh the stone, then he has no connection, the Kohen, to get that pumped up hechsher through his connection to the Ritzpah, because he's not standing on the Ritzpah. They removed that stone and he's standing on the earth. But if you're going to say that David HaMelech was Mekadesh all the way down to the Tahom, so then he's standing on the Ritzpah, and therefore his avodah is kshera. Tiboile kol hazor kula. If that's the case, why did Rav Ami raise the question with regard to one stone that got loose and was removed, and the Kohen stood on that place? Why did he ask that question about the entire Azara? And basically, if the entire Azara was removed, meaning the Ritzpah's Azara was removed, and he's standing anywhere in a place that used to be the Ritzpah, it would have the same suffix. Did David HaMelech sanctify until the Tahom? And the Gemara answers, Leolam Pshita Ledi Ad Aris the Tahom HaKadosh. Rabbi Ami was not vacillating. He understood very well with total certainty that David HaMelech was Makadesh, the Ritzpah, all the way through and through till the inner core of the universe. But Hachi Kami Boile, Derech Sheres B'Kach, Ein Derech Sheres B'Kach. If there's no Ritzpah at all at this point, and all you have is the earth, then for sure that's the way the Kohen would do the avodah, by standing directly on the earth. But in a case where they already have laid down the entire floor of the Azara, just that one particular stone got removed, and the Kohen decides to stand and do the avodah while he's in the place on the earth where that stone was removed, that's not derech avodah. Why did he do such a thing? That's not the normal way in which you do the avodah teku, and the Gemara doesn't have any answer. I just want to mention that my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik, in what's called Chidushei Agram V'Agriz Al Kodshim, has a whole discussion about the difference between what David was Makadesh and what Shlomo was Makadesh. Again, without getting into it, because it's way, way beyond our pay scale, he says there are two Kedushas in Migdash. There's what's called the Kedushas Makom, and then there's a Kedushas Mechitzos, which has to do with the wall and the building of the Migdash. So David generated a Kedushas Makom, where Shlomo Melech generated a Kedushas Migdash. Anyway, Kibel B'Smol Pasur Reb Shimon Machshir. We have Machlokas recorded in our Mishnah between the Tanakhama and Reb Shimon about a Kohen who did the avodah with his left hand instead of his right hand. Now, don't quote me on this because this requires research, but I think that this halacha applies even in the case of a lefty. Tana Rabbanon. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to analyze what are the Makoros in the Torah for both the Tanakhama Shita and Rabbi Shimon. So first, we're going to analyze the Shita of the Tanakhama in a Brisa, Tana Rabbanon. Now this pasuk is in Vayikra Perek Daled, V'lakacha Kohen midama chatos pe'etzba'o. So notice we'll underline two words here, V'lakach, and he, again, who is he? HaKohen, the Torah spells it out. And it says be'etzba'o. And then it says V'nasan. So it starts with V'lakach, and then it goes to V'nasan, Al Karnos HaMizbach, Mizbeach HaOla, which is the Mizbeach HaNechosh, Mizbeach HaChitzon. Be'etzba V'lakach. Okay, now the Gemara analyzes what's the difference between V'lakach and V'nasan. He takes and he places. V'nasan, I'm sorry, let's start with V'lakach. V'lakach means he receives the dam. That's called Kabbalas Hadam. And the Torah says, V'lakach HaKohen be'etzba. So that tells me, Malamid Shalot Tehei Kabbalah El B'Yamin. So the premise is that whenever the Torah speaks about a hand or a finger, it's always referring to the right side, unless we know otherwise. And the reason for that is the right side is always considered more chashuv. So again, he points out here, which is kind of obvious. I don't know if we need it, but anyway, what does it mean, kabol sadam? Not to say that he's makabel the dam in his hands, but it means he's holding a kli, which is called mizrak, and that kli, which is a receptacle, he's holding in his right hand. But then the brisa pulls a fast one and takes the word be etzba and pushes it forward in the pasuk, because in the next part of the pasuk says v'nosan. The word v'nosan is referring to the zrikas hadam ala mizbeach, and that too requires etzba. So both the Kabbalah and the Nesina, meaning the placing the dam onto the mizbeach, both have to be done with the right hand. Amar Reb Shimon, v'chi never yad b'Kabbalah ela b'etzba v'nosan, shlo tehei Nesina ela b'yamin. According to Rabbi Shimon, we take the word b'etzba and we push it forward. And we read the pasuk as if it said b'etzba v'nosan, that the Nesina has to be with his right hand. But hold v'lo never yad b'Kabbalah kibul b'smol kosher. Again, you might want to respect the avoda by using your right hand, but that does not, it's not crucial. It's only crucial in the case of betzbo v'nosan, referring to putting it on the mizbeach. So the machlokas now between Tanakama and Reb Shimon about Kabbalah biyad small, meaning he's holding on to the utensil for the Kabbalah biyad small, whereas the Tanakama disqualifies that Kabbalah and Rabbi Shimon validates it. It all revolves around whether or not you take the word etzba and you push it backwards towards v'lokach, which is Kabbalah, or forwards towards v'nosan, which is the zrika al gabi mizbeach. So the Gemara says the following: I don't get it. Reb Shimon mimonafshach. It's like Gzeira Shava. We're about to learn a Gzeira Shava that teaches us that that whatever applies should apply even to Kabbalah. Is therefore kilo nemer yad b'Kabbalah my havi? Who cares about whether it says yad if Rabbi Shimon accepted the Gzeira Shava, which we'll learn about in a minute? The ilesle Gzeira Shava, and if on the other hand Rabbi Shimon never had that Gzeira Shava, never received it, is ki nemer yad b'Kabbalah my havi? Even if the Torah would have said yad with regard to Kabbalah, okay, that would be lechatchila, but it would not be likuva, because as we said in Kodshim, that which is critical has to be repeated twice. Rabbi Yehuda liolam lesle Gzeira Shava. Rabbi Shimon never accepted the Gzeira Shava, and again we'll see about the Gzeira Shava. Well, Hachi Kamer, here's what Rabbi Shimon was arguing. V'chi nemar yad yamin b'Kabbalah. It doesn't say yad yamin anywhere with regard to Kabbalah. And hovlo never yad yamin b'Kabbalah, therefore kibel b'smol kosher. So mimonafshach. If you're going to require yad yamin based on the Gzeira Shava, Reb Shimon never accepted the Gzeira Shava. And if you're going to say because the word yad appears in the context of Kabbalah, the answer is it does not appear in the context of Kabbalah. Amalei Rabba was not happy about this. Why not apply the same logic to Nesina? Rabbi Shimon conceded that the Nesina has to be done, and that's critical, with Yad Yamin, and yet he doesn't have the Gzeira Shava. If he doesn't have the Gzeira Shava, the Torah says Etzba, but it doesn't say Yad. And furthermore, the Rabbi Shimon Gzeira Shava, I'm going to prove to you from a brisa that Rabbi Shimon went on record as accepting the Gzeira Shava. Because Rabbi Shimon Omer in this brisa, Kol Mokom Shenemar Yad Eina Ela B'Yamin, Etzba Eina Ela B'Yamin. In other words, that the word Etzba takes on the same meaning and communicates the same idea as yad. And since this pasuk says etzba, therefore, not only in the case of Nesina would Yad Yamin be an absolute requirement, but even in the case of Kabbalah. So we don't understand Reb Shimon. And this is all the Gzeirah Shava that equates Yad and Etzba. Elam, Rava says, Leolam Isla Gzeirah Shava, we have to go back to our original position that Reb Shimon accepted the Gzeirah Shava. Achi Kamar. V'chi nemer Yad b'Kabbalah, hovlo nemer Yad b'Kabbalah, ela Etzba. V'yefshel Kabbalah b'Etzba. Is kiva b'smol kosher. True. We have yad in Kabbalah by virtue and through the medium of the Gzeirah Shava, and Reb Shimon also accepts the Gzeirah Shava. But Reb Shimon says that with regard to Kabbalah or Nesina, we don't know which one, the Torah used the word etzba. So now you have a toss-up. Is etzba a requirement of Yad Yamin for Velokach, meaning Kabbalah, or for Vinasa, meaning Nesina? But the answer is, how in the world can a Kohen do the avoda of Kabbalah Sadam with one finger? What is he, twirling the kli on one finger? The Gemara is going to work it out that he can do it. But right now, Rava holds he can't do it. So therefore the etzba, which we didn't know whether it goes backwards or forwards, back to Kabbalah or forwards to Nesina, it has to go by definition forwards to Nesina. Cannot be a requirement of Yad Yamin with regard to Kabbalah because the word etzba excludes Kabbalah. There's no Kabbalah with one etzba. Amalei Rav Sama Breder Rav Ashi Ravina, what are you talking about? You're saying it's impossible to be makabel adam with an etzba? Very simple. After the Ovidle Ozen Lasfas Mizrak, umakabel ba. All he has to do is set up what the Gemara in the Talmudic language is called an ear. How would you say it in our language? When you attach a loop, a metal loop to the kli. I'm sure there's a word for it. Okay. And he just holds up the kli with his one finger, so that the word etzba could therefore relate even to Kabbalah. So again, as we said before, you can't twirl a kli on one finger. That agile he can't be. But what he could do is he could hold up the kli with one finger by putting his finger into the loop that's attached to the kli. Steve, come on, help me out here. What's the word in English for, okay. So now we've rejected Rava, and now we're going to have to see Abai. Abai is going to come up with a different explanation for Rabbi Shimon.